Good afternoon. Thank you so much for making the time to come today. Welcome. It's lovely to see you all. My name's Ainsley Newson. I coordinate the Sydney Health Ethics Network, which is a network in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. And I'll be chairing this event today, but as you'll come to see, there's lots of people involved. Before we start the proceedings formally, I will now work out why the clicker and the mouse don't work. Right. Before we start proceedings formally, I'd first like to acknowledge that we are coming together in a hybrid way. We have quite a few attendees online, but for everybody in Australia and indeed in many other countries globally, we are coming together on Indigenous land. And here in Sydney, on the Camperdown campus of the University of Sydney, we are on unceded Gadigal lands, part of the Eora Nation. And with my colleagues from Sydney Health Ethics, I'd like to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So I pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including elders past and present, and in particular, any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are attending or watching this event. And in particular, for thousands of years, Gadigal peoples have shared and exchanged knowledges for the benefit of all, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this lecture is named in honour of Emeritus Professor Miles Little. And the lecture was established in 2018 when Miles was still with us. And it was established with his permission, but his slight embarrassment. And we've had several lecturers preceding the one today, including one by Professor Wendy Rogers, who is with us today. Thank you for coming. Other lecturers include Associate Professor Bridget Hare, Professor Jackie Leach-Scully, and Professor Rachel Ankeny and Professor Marie Toombs. Miles died in 2023 at the age of 89. He was a distinguished scholar, surgeon, academic, poet, thinker, and humanist. He was the founding professor of surgery at Westmead Hospital, and he played a central role in shaping what surgical education looked like in Australia. But what always set Miles apart was a really unwavering and strong commitment to looking beyond the technical aspects of medicine. He was very deeply interested in ethical aspects, philosophical considerations more broadly, and the social and human dimensions of health and what it means to be healthy. And that interest led him to undertake what was quite a radical decision in the 1990s, which was to step back from medicine in the day-to-day practice and establish a centre, which was called the Centre for Values, Ethics and the Law in Medicine at the University of Sydney. And that centre is now Sydney Health Ethics. And this was a pioneering initiative that brought together doctors, other clinicians, philosophers and patients to explore the moral and ethical and values-based foundations of medicine and healthcare more broadly. So we are Sydney Health Ethics, and we produce scholarship to do with critical and engaged ethics and other social issues in health. And we teach bioethics and we teach qualitative health methods and other things as well. And we work within and among community locally, nationally and internationally to understand and address real world issues as they come up in health and well-being. And we do this using lots of different methods, including ethics, but also including social science, health humanities and law. And we want to achieve a positive social impact by engaging in academic and public conversations, and sometimes both at the same time, about ethics in health and well-being. And Miles is with us all the time. I have a leaflet from his celebration at the University of Sydney on the wall opposite my desk, and I sort of nod to him frequently when I'm working, and I sometimes ask him a question or two. But he was a very thoughtful and kind colleague, a very rigorous scholar, and someone who believed that medicine should always be grounded in humanity. And this lecture is one way that we aim to continue that legacy. This lecture is a space for rigorous thought, for compassion, and the kind of interdisciplinary dialogue that Miles championed so passionately. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this event today. And in particular, I'd like to welcome Alistair Little, Miles's son, who's made time out of his busy day to come here and listen as well. Thank you for coming and welcome. And I'd now like to introduce our speaker for the lecture this year, Dr. Bryan Mukandi. Dr. Mukandi studied medicine at the University of Zimbabwe, and he then interned at the United Bulawayo Hospital before emigrating to Ireland, where he studied social sciences and philosophy. And then he moved to Australia, and he did this more than a decade ago, and he's had a range of academic appointments since in health policy and systems research, medical ethics and philosophy. And he now focuses his work across three broad areas: meta-philosophy, philosophies of the global south, and the health humanities. And all of his work is united by a concern for the marginalised. I first met Bryan some years ago, and is so often the way two academics based in Australia had to go to the other side of the world to meet each other, and we met in the Netherlands. I was immediately struck by his really fierce intellect, but also his wonderful humility and his sense of humour. And I so look forward to hearing what you have to say today, Bryan. So with that, please welcome Dr. Bryan Mukandi from the University of Wollongong to speak on the past, present, how we got this chaos and what we do about it. And I will welcome you. And just by way of procedures, which I should have done before, I'm sorry, is to say Bryan will provide his lecture. We'll then have a very brief Q&A for kind of burning points specifically on his lecture. And then I will introduce my colleague, Associate Professor Claire Hooker, who will in turn introduce our two panelists for today. It's like a cascade of introductions. And then they'll talk amongst themselves to us for a few moments before we have a wider discussion in conversation with the panelists. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, thank you all so much for being here. It's an absolute joy and an honor. I also would like to start by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of this place, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations, and to acknowledge the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians where I live and work on the South Coast. In grappling with how we arrived at this moment, I'm going to tell a predominantly African story. I'm going to share with you something of my own in the hopes that it spurs a greater interest and investment in the story of this place and the story of the many others who call this place home, particularly those First Nations peoples who've been here the longest. I'd also like to pay my respect to Miles Little, to his family, including Alistair Little, and to all those who work to build on and protect the Miles Little legacy. I'm deeply honored and touched to have been asked to add my brick to the wonderful edifice that's been worked on by a really impressive group of scholars, including Professor Wendy Rogers, Bridget Hare, Jackie Leach Scully, Marie Toombs, and Rachel Ankeny. Finally, I would like to thank all the organizers and everyone who's had a hand in ensuring that today goes smoothly. Thanks especially to Camilla Scanlon and to Jack Temple for your help with logistics. Thank you, Shay and Annie, for being the wonderful friends who've agreed to come out and play. And thank you, Ainsley and Claire, for generously agreeing to do the work of holding up the space of our discussion to come. Thank you all, everybody who's come, for taking time out of your day to join in this public discussion, whether in person or online. Thank you all. Okay, so I belong to a particular branch of philosophy where we write things down because we like to have arguments over trivialities, right? And so we want to make sure that everything we say is exactly right so that so-and-so doesn't come and say, but what about? I've also found it helpful because I have a way of, I'm drawn to mischief and I have a way of landing myself in trouble. So writing things down forces me to be a little bit more judicious than I otherwise might be. So bear with me. The past, present, how we got this chaos and what we do about it. In 1977, Melbourne University Press published a beautiful collection of Miles Little's poems titled Round Trip. According to Leonie Kramer, Little's professional experience as a surgeon feeds his poetry. His alertness to the world about him is reflected in his language, and respect for the past and commitment to the present, finely adjusted to each other, enrich the texture of his poetry. I wholeheartedly agree. My favorite poem in that collection, I think, might be A Present Past. Ooh. Morning comes up like a time of day, unaccountable tricks of the light, and the long shadows having some way of sharp deceit. Then the mind's sight clearly retrieves remembered hands, stroking the stem of a glass, or the dust, luminous image of someone stands by a rail unsaddling a horse, just beyond reach of the trusting eye. Bees humming warms the wistaria's honey. The bare dirt waits for the scent of a storm coming. Hawks hang in the memorial air. The past, the present past, broods like a day of summer whose stray and clouded shift of moods love and hold and lose. That alertness to the world, cognizance of the lingering presence of the past, and commitment to the present, which Kramer pointed out, are so beautifully, so poignantly rendered in this poem. I'm going to attempt to traverse similar ground over the course of this lecture, from the vantage of the madness that has engulfed us in 2025. However, while I have on numerous occasions taken shelter in poetic evasion and dissimulation, this afternoon I want to assume the mantle of the medical practitioner, despite the fact that I gave up clinical practice 2 decades ago. Don't worry. I don't think there's any need to reiterate all the trouble in the world right now. It's enough, I think, to repeat the words that my friend David Austin, author of an amazing book titled Dread, Poetry, and Freedom, spoke to me a couple of years ago. Brian, David said, Babylon is burning. Given that, I'm going to present you with a 3-part diagnosis followed by a 3-part prescription. There's some bitter medicine for us to swallow here. I am confident, however, that this is an earnest gathering. We all want to better understand the trouble in the world because we're invested in a brighter shared future. And even if I get things horribly wrong in what follows, don't worry. You'll have the opportunity of a second opinion from Drs. Ndrusi and Abimola. And you'll soon find that both of them are absolutely brilliant. So you're in good hands. All right. Diagnosis 1, a lack of shame. Once upon a time, in a small gathering of preteen children, somewhere in my native Zimbabwe, a naughty child taught a naughty story that's followed me to this day. The basic gist is this. One day, a long, long time ago, before some mythical hammer struck the world and in so doing caused the world's enchantment to recede, a child walked through a sacred forest. At some point, when this child was in the most sacred part of the sacred forest, they thought, I need to go potty. Now, rather than bear the discomfort, this child decided to defecate in a place where one isn't supposed to defecate. The child got up and walked away. Not long after that, the child thought they could smell something funny and thought that maybe they had been a little bit careless a little bit earlier. They kept on walking, and to their horror, soon realized that this fecal matter had come to life. In this story, it's been decades and decades, so I don't remember the details, but I think this lump of excrement might have started singing to this child, making accusations of what this child had done. On entering back into society, this child was absolutely mortified. The issue here, to be clear, wasn't that someone's droppings had come to life. This was an enchanted period, so that sort of thing happened. Nor was it the reminder that we all go to the toilet. There is absolutely nothing shameful in our bodily functions. The issue was that this individual had violated a core tenet of that society. I suspect that the reason that ngano, that folk tale, was introduced into the community in which I was raised was to educate us into a mode of life that takes very seriously the possibility that one might have to account publicly for the wrongs one commits in secret. The past, in other words, is not inert. The idea of things staying buried in the past doesn't necessarily hold. Our actions sometimes vibrate into the future. Another, maybe even more important function of the ngano is the cultivation of a sense of shame before the collective. Shame is complicated and lends itself to abuse and manipulation, granted. But a society that's incapable of shame, a society that's insensitive to the non-violent regulation of behavior in the interest of the collective good, is a society in peril, I think. It's clear to me that the majority of mainstream Australia was not raised with the story of the child who relieved themselves in the sacred part of the sacred forest. I think we're all poorer for that omission. When things smell funny, the tendency is to look around for only the most proximate of potential causes. The planet is teetering on the brink of environmental catastrophe, and adults with important job titles, whose material comfort is the envy of the so-called world, will say in all seriousness, China has to take responsibility and stop manufacturing so much. This is despite the fact that Chinese labor power and local environmental damage is what furnishes their homes and workplaces. Nor is there a thought given to the history of global political economy, the history of capital accumulation, nor the distribution of benefits and harms of the global industrial machine. The stench of injustice somehow fails to elicit more than the most cursory of glances around for its sources. And it certainly doesn't cause very many to blush in shame. But potential environmental collapse might be a little bit abstract for some, and it might be unreasonable to expect everyone to be able to follow calculations of flows of capital. What about genocide? I grew up in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, right next door to South Africa. The apartheid regime there was the stuff of my nightmares. In addition, I was born months after the country gained its political independence. Some of my teachers in junior school had been proud Rhodesians, and their attitudes towards me and the majority of their compatriots was obvious. The idea of a racial hierarchy is one with which I am intimately familiar, having been born near the bottom rung of that ladder. Though spared the worst of the violence there by luck, having also been born to middle-class parents. Still, I know apartheid. So when tens of thousands of people are killed in a period of less than 2 years, and there isn't the same kind of government and civil society mobilization as we've seen following Ukrainian loss of life. For example, Germany, France, and Britain aren't increasing their military budgets in order to be better equipped to defend Palestinian innocents. When I see all this, my reflex is to travel time of the source of the stench. So I think about that other medical practitioner and humanist, Frantz Fanon, in Tunisia and Algeria in the 1950s, taking his French friend to task for their complicity with colonialism. Fanon wrote to his friend, "When people want to know why you left this country, what will you do to stifle the shame that already burdens you?" And it's interesting, in the French original, it's this shame which is already following, this shame which is already lingering, much like that little boy's shame was lingering. Nonsense. The shame of not having understood, of not having wanted to understand what has happened around you every day. For 8 years, you've been in this country, and no part of its enormous wound has held you back in any way. No part of this enormous wound has pushed you in any way. You've been free at last to discover yourself. You've been free at last to discover yourself such as you are. Concerned about man, but strangely not about the Arab. Worried, anguished, torn. But right out in the open, your immersion in the same mud, the same leprosy. For there's not a European who's not revolted, indignant, alarmed at everything, except the fate to which the Arab is subjected. Unperceived Arabs, ignored Arabs, Arabs passed over in silence, Arabs spirited away, dissimulated, Arabs daily denied, transformed into the Saharan stage set. There we could add Arabs displaced in the hopes of building luxury apartments with seaside views. But it wasn't just the French disregarding the humanity of non-Europeans. Harvard history professor Caroline Elkins writes the following about the early stages of her doctoral research on colonial Kenya in the 1950s. Quote, I began with a preliminary sift through the official archives in London, where files stuffed with dusty, yellow memos and reports told a seductive story about Britain's civilizing mission during the last years of colonial rule in Kenya. When I presented my dissertation proposal to my department in the winter of 1997, I was intending to write a history of the success of Britain's civilizing mission in the detention camps of Kenya. End quote. Unlike Fanon's friend, however, Elkin did sit, eat and drink with regular Africans in Kenya. This made clear to her the fast that was the official narrative and drove her to pursue her research further. She goes on to write, quote, almost a decade after I started my research, my view on the detention camps, as well as British colonial policy in Kenya, has changed dramatically. I've come to believe that during the Mau Mau War, British forces wielded their authority with a savagery that betrayed a perverse colonial mentality. Only by detaining the entire Kikuyu population of 1.5 and physically and psychologically men, women, and children could colonial authority be restored and the civilizing mission reinstated. I now believe there was in late colonial Kenya a murderous campaign to eliminate the Kikuyu, a campaign that left tens of thousands of people, perhaps hundreds of thousands, dead. Elkin's thorough studies led to the conclusion that British forces in the 1950s displayed gruesome savagery in defense of British colonial interests. That tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of Africans were killed in the process, with over 1 million displaced, and that the majority of those killed and displaced were non-combatants. Just waiting for that reverberation to sink in. This is the outcome of what Elkin calls perverse colonial logic. Given that, it ought not be controversial to identify the same savagery and to see the same perverse colonial logic in the actions of the Israel Defense Forces. That ought not be a controversial claim. And if it is, you've got to ask why. Elkin's book hasn't been banned. It hasn't been suppressed. The British government made a public apology, in part drawing on that research and those findings. If it's not controversial to say that British forces wielded their authority with a savagery that betrayed a perverse colonial logic, how could it possibly be controversial to say that the Israel Defense Forces are wielding their authority with a savagery that betrays a perverse colonial logic? How? As a nation, though, we in Australia have abetted the slaughter of innocents and the survivors and the starvation of the survivors. Rather than face that head on, the general tendency is for the state and the media to growl and bare their teeth at those who have tried to get us to address this shame that will perpetually follow us. Diagnosis 2, consensual hallucination. Another story, this time my own. I am not a political partisan. Yeah, I am invested in politics as a social activity that we all engage in, the kind of activity that Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics says is even more important than ethics. But I'm not a political partisan. Bear that in mind. So, do you remember when Peter Dutton said that people in Melbourne were afraid to go out at night for fear of roving African gangs? Oh. I have some wonderful African friends in Melbourne. They bear absolutely no resemblance to the figure that Dutton had conjured. A figure that I read as the progeny of Mau Mau terrorizing urban and suburban Australian civility. Mau Mau was the name British settlers gave to Kenyan peasants who decided to engage in armed struggle against their occupiers. Some of those peasant farmers committed horrendous atrocities, overwhelmingly directed towards fellow African Kenyans, but also some directed towards the settler community. Yet appalling as this was, and it's appalling, and yes, I'm morally consistent, I repudiate and denounce acts of violence against civilians regardless of who commits them. Appalling as this was, these were desperate, enraged peasant farmers, as human as you or I, who called themselves the Land and Freedom Army. British colonists in Kenya, on the other hand, imagined them as, quote, scarcely part of humanity's continuum, quote, indistinguishable in thought and expression from the animals that roamed the colony. One colonial administrator called them, quote, a seething mass of bestiality. And as Elkins discovered, quote, that sentiment would become more and more widespread because the settlers were so effective in promoting their view. Again, I wait for the reverberations to strike. When Dutton began to conjure African gang members from children who look like my gentle, kind 15-year-old son, it was obvious to me that he was drawing on a past that's still present. But I digress. I told you that I had a story. So earlier this year, I attended a lovely gathering in Brisbane, an anti-racism symposium organized by the Karamba Institute at QUT, which is led by Chelsea Wattergo. On the first day, there was a light-hearted event during which speakers were to parade and make fun of racist views. Sarah Schwartz, legal director of the Human Rights Law Center, decided to make fun of the ways in which Peter Dutton had invoked Jewish people for his own political ends. She caricatured what she called, quote unquote, Dutton's Jews. She wasn't making fun of any real people, but the figure that Dutton had conjured, in the same way that I might make fun of Dutton's African gang member. That person doesn't exist. Yet word of, quote unquote, Dutton's Jews leaked to the press from a private event and was used to characterize the symposium as one that was anti-Semitic. Just to add to the farce, Sarah Schwartz is Jewish. Days later, at the same event, it was action-packed. Randa Abdel Fattah made an innocuous comment about ensuring that public funding for research within community groups, where knowledge is being derived in concert with those groups, is of some financial benefit to those groups rather than merely benefiting the researchers. If you want to take Abdel Fattah to task, take it to task for unoriginality. Huh? Fred Moten, Stefano Hani, and the undercomments say exactly the same thing. And it's been celebrated and repeated ad nauseum by scholars around the world. Yet, Abdel Fattah's comments were seized on, and they seem to have been what triggered a series of events whereby a whole government minister took public action, which eventuated in the suspension of Abdel Fattah's prestigious research fellowship. Abdel Fattah is Palestinian. And from what I've been able to make out, all this, the suspension, everything that led to the suspension of her fellowship, boils down to the fact that some people don't appreciate the manner in which she articulated her outrage at the genocide of her people. Now, I've only met and spoken to Randa once. It was at that symposium. She was warm and generous, despite the fact that I'd interrupted her in what looked like a fun conversation which she was having with her friend, a Jewish scholar I'd met for the first time the day before. The relative silence with which the academic community has responded to Abdel Fattah's situation is particularly striking. My initial way of making sense of it was through Charles Mills's concept of consensual hallucination. The Jamaican philosopher thinks the social contract theorized by Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, John Rawls, and others never existed and merely papers over reality. That reality, Mills suggests, Mills in concerts and reading people like Carol Pateman, who suggested something very similar with respect to gender. That reality Mills suggests is the reality is instead a situation in which members of certain groups, and on Mills's account, mostly white people, constitute full persons who rule over those deemed subpersons. That is, the organizing contract that actually exists is one in which, the organizing contract is between those who belong to the socio-political category that is person, in a context in which many human beings, many groups of people are excluded from that category of person. Now imagine some of you will protest the idea that you would deny anyone's personhood. And some will also defend Peter Dutton from the same charge. Mills preempts this. He claims that along with personhood, the system that prevails offers its beneficiaries what he calls, quote, an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, which produces the ironic outcome that beneficiaries will in general be unable to understand the world that they themselves have made. As a result, signatories to the prevailing state of affairs are spared the memory of what they did in the sacred forest. To a significant extent, they will live in what he calls an invented delusional world, a racial fantasy land, a consensual hallucination. Perhaps disregard for Abdel Fattah and for Palestinian life more broadly can be explained by the fact that within the schema of the racial contract that Mills theorizes, there is no expectation that subpersons be afforded anything like the political or social rights due to full persons, the humanity of those supposed subpersons notwithstanding. Diagnosis 3, foolishness. That was Charles Mills. Third story. This one comes from the brilliant 1995 film La Haine, or The Hate in English. One of the characters in the film tells a story, a parable really, of a man who falls from the 5th floor of a building. As this man hurls past each floor, in order to reassure himself, he keeps repeating the phrase, jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Jusqu'ici, up till this point, tout va bien. Everything's going okay. Everything's going well. Or more colloquially, so far, so good. Yeah. The man's falling from the 5th floor. Gets to the fourth. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Falls a little more. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Keeps falling. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Keeps falling. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. We aren't told how the story ends, but that's because it's obvious. All we're told by the narrator is that the fall isn't important. What matters is the landing. The trouble with our collective insensibility to the past, regardless of its stench, and with the fact that so many are so completely caught up in a consensual hallucination is this. Our collective mantra as a society might as well be, jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Over and over again, it's the lucky country this, the most successful multicultural nation that, a fair go, a brighter future, playing our part in ensuring global security, and all manner of saccharine inanities, all of which are variations on jusqu'ici, tout va bien. As we plunge deeper and deeper into crisis. It's utter foolishness. It's dangerous. And for those of us who aren't willing ourselves into hallucination, it's terrifying. We would do well to learn what others have gained from painful experience. I'm reminded of B. Bandele's magnificent, posthumously published novel, Yoruba Boy Running. Hang on. Part of the brilliant tale he weaves is an account of a wonderful young woman and an impressive man who are on the verge of consummating their love and beginning a shared life when events take over. Events, moreover, that had been brewing for some time. These characters knew that all wasn't well, but they assumed that there was a little bit more time to address the chaos. Here, that woman's prayer to Eshu, the Orisha or deity of the crossroads, just before calamity struck. I pounded yam softly and offered it to Destiny's gatekeeper, Eshu himself. Eshu refused to eat. Then I asked him, will you stay indoors or go outside? Outside, answered the guests. When death comes looking for me, she said, it will meet Eshu outside, the chorus. When illness comes looking for me, it will meet Eshu outside. When evil comes looking for me, it will meet Eshu outside. What if a child comes looking for him? Eshu will bring him into your room. And if laughter comes looking for me, Eshu will show him in. And if good fortune comes looking for me, Eshu will tell him to knock on your door. As Bandele shows in this final masterpiece that he bequeathed to us, which traces one facet of the history of West Africa, one does not presume to speak for Eshu, nor is it wise to assume that only good will visit you. Calamity can strike even those most comfortably cocooned in the world of their own making. Okay. So those are my diagnoses for what ails us as a society. A lack of shame, consensual hallucinations, and foolishness. Now, it's obvious that I'm not qualified to prescribe solutions for the world's problems. What I want to offer here, though, is a starting point for things we might discuss. If it's correct that we're hurtling towards oblivion, then perhaps we might be able to collectively work out how to rouse ourselves and each other into action and change. So, with that in mind, my first prescription is that we stop. My thinking here is informed by a German Jewish political theorist, a South African writer, and a Nigerian musician. I know it sounds like the beginning of a joke, but bear with me. Hannah Arendt, in a brilliant lecture, says that thinking demands that we stop. He says that thinking itself, thinking as opposed to that reflex to fall back on cliches and conventional wisdom. Thinking, Hannah Arendt says, is difficult, it can be paralyzing, and it demands that we stop. Iraqi-Canadian philosopher Ali Al-Saji wrote a beautiful, beautiful article titled, "When Thinking Hesitates." Arendt and Al-Saji make it clear that the first step to altering our trajectory is to interrupt the given pattern or tempo of our lives. We need to stop. We need to stop trying to outrun the filth that follows us. This is easier said than done. Peter Abrams illustrates that difficulty in his brilliant 1956 novel, A Wreath for Udomo. The protagonist, Udomo, asks a representative of a country patterned on apartheid South Africa why they persist with a race-based system of governance, where civil and political rights are guaranteed to the settler community but are denied to the indigenous population. Udomo presses this individual because it seems so obvious that in the long run, apartheid is untenable. The response he gets is instructive. "One day our reign will end," says the advocate for apartheid, "but not today." The fact that today, that right now, things haven't yet come to a crashing halt is enough for the proponent of apartheid. The only way things will change is if we stop. What if too many of us are too invested in the status quo to countenance divestment, no matter the injustice, the brutality, or the stench? Nigerian musician Asha grapples with this in a beautiful 2007 song, Fire on the Mountain. Here's the first verse. And as much as I can hear it playing, I'm tempted to sing it to you. You're very welcome. I'm going to restrain myself. But go listen to it when you go home. It's amazing. It's beautiful. I wake up in the morning. Tell you what I see on my TV screen. I see the blood of an innocent child, and everybody's watching. Now I'm looking out my window, and what do I see? I see an army of a soldier man marching across the street. Hey, Mr. Soldier Man, tomorrow is the day you go to war, but you're fighting for another man's cause, and you don't even know him. Oh, what did he say to make you so blind to your conscience and your reason? Could it be love for your country or for the gun you're using killing? The philosopher Louis Althusser argued that the teacher and the priest are often conscripted to the same ideological ends as the police officer and the soldier. The question that Asha puts to Mr. Soldier Man applies to most, if not all of us in this room. Love of what exactly impels us to prop up the horrible brutalities that have visited on innocents, here and abroad, in the name of securing our supposed interests? We must stop and think this through. Prescription number 2, study. The incentive structures of our university system punish study. The fact is, most academics are not scholars. The path to high productivity allows for few detours. So we learn how to publish as efficiently as possible, and we conduct research that's so streamlined, we aren't in danger of stumbling into other worlds and other modes of being in the world. Hence, you'll typically find a greater number at a networking event than at a reading group. You're also more likely to find an early career academic wondering if you might help them get onto some platform than seeking guidance around which literature to read or community groups to approach as a means of establishing non-instrumental relationships. Genuine study demands divestiture. It means coming to terms with and being honest about one's limitations. It means foregoing spotlights and material benefits. Hardest of all, perhaps, might be the loss of a kind of sovereignty of the self. The discomfort of at times submitting to the epistemic authority of others, or at least placing oneself in context in which one goes from being an authority to being a student. This is all tremendously difficult. I find it tremendously difficult. But I've been fortunate to have remarkable friends who've modeled various aspects of genuine individual and collective study to me. I think of people like Chelsea Wattago, Helen Mo, Omidi Ochieng, Nick Southall, David Austin, and many, many, many others. The trouble of starting to name people is like there's people you should have named who you forget, but I love all of my friends. I think you're all brilliant. For those who've been less fortunate, I highly, highly recommend Kwan-Sing Chen's Asia's method and Aziz Chowdhury's learning activism as potential starting points to think through. Study. Prescription 3, humanizing the world. I want to dance with something tangible, other than my shadow. Let's you and me cascade across the lounge room floor. I shift the couch, you pour the wine. Let's then dream. I can be happy, you can laugh. The lounge room becomes a paradise where pain and undiagnosed nervous conditions desist. There's so much warmth and light and gaiety in Lisa Bellier's lovely poem, Come Dancing. One might miss its profundity. The desire for human contact in this piece, the idea of sharing the world as a precondition for disalienation, recalls Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. We need not spend any time with Hegel, though. I think it'd be more interesting to follow Bellier to Hannah Arendt instead. I have in mind Arendt's public address on receiving the Lessing Prize from the city of Hamburg in 1959, the opening piece to her wonderful book, Men in Dark Times. There, Arendt claimed that the world lies between people. That is, we can exist and even thrive in our insular private spaces, but the world as she understands it is a shared space, that shared project that we enter, affirm, and affect by way of discourse and deliberation. Moreover, Arendt writes, quote, withdrawal from the world need not harm an individual. He may even cultivate great talents to the point of genius and so by detour be useful to the world again. But with each such retreat, an almost demonstrable loss of the world takes place. What is lost is the specific and usually irreplaceable in-between, which should have formed between this individual and his fellow men. End quote. Arendt doesn't begrudge the introverts and the frightened from taking their leave of the public realm from time to time. She does, however, ask all of us to understand the cost. When we opt out of engagement with the world that we share with our fellow humans, everybody's poor. This is one of those places where Arendt and her Trinidadian contemporary, C.L.R. James, come very close to each other. James thinks representative democracy impoverishes us by habituating us to stepping away from the public realm, having delegated our responsibility to contribute to the shape of the world to some elected official. There are times when I hear colleagues speak about some professor or dean or some other delegated authority as though that person, by virtue of their job title, had more at stake in the nature of our shared campus world, or more responsibility for ensuring it remained human than the rest of us. How often do we and our colleagues make the calculation that it's in our interest to stay on the right side of the head of school manager, or some other official whom Kafka or Sartre might have caricatured? This supposed pragmatism, Arendt reads as dark portent. Quote, history knows many periods of dark times in which the public realm has been obscured and the world becomes so dubious that people have ceased to ask any more of politics than that it showed due consideration for their vital interests and personal liberty, end quote. What this looks like in practice is the decision not to speak loudly about or challenge Abdel Fattah's treatment because you recognize that your name might very well find its way on the list of redundancies at the next restructure. And that's not to say I'm against prudence. Arendt says that in dark times, quote, flight from the world to concealment, from public life to anonymity, is not only justified, it may be one's only real avenue. There's a difference, though. There's a difference between recognizing that circumstances make it unwise to speak publicly in this particular forum and habituation into silence across the board in the hopes that one will accrue sufficient personal capital to survive whatever may eventuate. The personal capital that one accumulates, Arendt calls strength. She contrasts this with power, which is what people acting in concert might grow together. Importantly, Arendt argues that, quote, wherever strength is confronted by power, strength will always succumb, i.e. collective power trumps individual privatized strength. This room is filled, I imagine, with people who could wax lyrical on the evils of neoliberalism and worse, the neoliberalization of the university. Yet at exactly the same time, good ways, at exactly the same time, the primary survival strategy that is employed by the majority of people in this room as the means of dealing with impending crash to the ground is the accumulation of privatized strength. Incredibly, the same holds for the union. University unionism is promoted as a kind of insurance policy and as a means of helping the policyholders accumulate as much private strength as possible. It doesn't primarily operate as a facilitator for discussion and deliberation. It doesn't primarily organize reading groups aimed at helping academics study the ways in which past generations of workers accumulated the power with which to resist capital's strength. It hasn't seen its primary role as facilitating nationwide discussions around environmental crises or Israel's genocide and starvation of Palestinians. I imagine James and Arendt would say that the reason is that we've allowed the union, like the political party, like workplace management, to function as representative bodies, that we've lost sight of the fact that every cook can govern, and that every cook should get a turn in doing so. And we are suffering the consequences of having vacated the world. Things have, as a result, grown unsurprisingly dim. I want to dance with something tangible, other than my shadow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was so rich, and I'm going to be thinking about it for a very long time to come. We have a few moments now for just general questions immediately following Dr. Mukandi's presentation before we move into the panel. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And Jack, will you be managing the online questions? And the ceiling mics are on, aren't they? Yes, great. I can see that they are.
Don't be shy, I promise I'm nice.
While everyone's gathering their thoughts, what I really heard coming through there is there's a call to arms. And there's a call to arms in lots of different ways. One is around a reckoning of things that we are all guilty of. Secondly, around the ways that we can perhaps change, and we can change on lots of different levels. It could be from how we greet our colleagues to how we structure our meetings to much bigger activities. And I guess what I'd like to pick up in some of that is what you said right towards the end of your lecture around this notion of collective power. Because it's something I guess I'm enculturated to think of power very much as an individual thing that we wield against each other, but you're using it perhaps in a much more positive way. And so I guess just if we're thinking about actions that need to change, that we can change, both as individuals and collectives, how do we switch out of that mode of thinking about power, which is maybe, at least in my experience, a way that we have been enculturated to think about it, to wield that collective power in a way that can actually enact change?
Oh, nice, easy question. It's a wonderful question. Look, so David Austin, who I invoked near the beginning, is writing a book on C.L.R. James. It's titled C.L.R. James, Philosopher of the Dispossessed. And David has this thing about thinking through the dialectic of the I and the we, right? And kind of grappling with these two kind of contradictory or potentially seemingly contradictory thing, and holding and bringing that tension together being what kind of sparks movement, right? Not necessarily resolution, but movement, action. And the thing is, you're right, like, so on the one hand, look, you know, I am not able to affect what geopolitical actors do, right? How Benjamin Netanyahu feels when he wakes up in the morning has nothing to do with me. You know, there are people who I imagine Donald Trump listens to. I don't know them, and Anthony Albanese isn't my friend, right? I have no access to levers of power, owners of large amounts of capital. You know, those aren't the circles I travel in. And there's a temptation to say to then, well, as a result, what can I do? I'm going to just withdraw, right? And que sera, sera, leave the world to the rules of the world. And maybe try be like a flea on the back of one of them and survive that way. I think, you know, there's a question about what our individual responsibility in humanizing the world. What is it that we can do? And sometimes we can't. You know, sometimes it's not prudent to be the one who speaks. But if the nature of your interactions are all kind of privatized, Aaron makes the distinction between the intimacy of the private sphere and public friendship, right? If your whole world becomes that intimate sphere, and all you ever engage with are your intimates, then you can have no bearing on the world, right? I think the responsibility that we have as people is to move beyond, at times, the comfortable realm of the intimate and engage with others, and particularly others we don't like, and deliberate in various ways. And so sometimes that deliberation, the appropriate place to have it, isn't in a public sphere, right? Like, sometimes it isn't in that particular meeting, but there's a conversation to be had with the rest of your colleagues after the fact. And I think if we thought more in terms of our ability to impact our world as individuals and the worlds around us, because we do have that impact, right? We have the impact. Those of you who teach know that sometimes you have two good students and it completely changes the class and the tenor of it and the dynamics of it. Yeah? You have two engaged people of conscience in a room who say, no, actually, boss, like, that's just some BS, like, that won't fly. And that can have an impact. And I think that Aaron's investment in not retreating from the world is that the larger and the more vibrant it becomes, the more power that's aggregated. And then maybe there's the ability to push back against the strength of certain political actors or business actors.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, and is there one online as well, Jack? Okay, Wendy Rogers, I'll invite you to ask your question. It should get picked up by the ceiling microphones. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Wendy.
Think about there, as Ainsley said, and I was very much attracted to the diagnostic and therapeutic aspects of the talk and sharing your background, I do. But I really was struck with the loss of shame as your diagnosis, and I was wondering whether that's really like the primary one and the other two are kind of secondary in a way, because if I was thinking about it, to admit that we all, participate and collude in misinformation would be shameful.
Yeah.
And to admit that we're foolish would be shameful as well.
Yeah.
It seems this resistance to shame is just a really pervasive and dangerous thing that's happened. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that and how can we recover our capacity to feel shame?
I mean,
could you just repeat the question as well? I think the online mics might have picked it up, but the room didn't hear it so well.
Sure. No, Wendy's unsurprisingly brilliant question was, is the lack of shame what pervades? Is that the primary thing? Does that kind of pervade the other diagnoses? And I think so, right? It's funny, I tell my students, I never know what I am thinking until I've written it, and then I read it and I'm surprised. I'm like, oh, that's what I thought. I think when I started, I thought these were three distinct separate things, but I think they're elaboration on the same thing, on the same theme, and I think that theme is ultimately a lack of shame. Because, I'm an introvert, believe it or not. I would rather not speak in front of you, I mean that in the nicest possible way. I don't like attention. I don't want to take a public stand on anything, right? I just don't. Like, life is simpler if you don't. But I was shamed by and driven, like the sense of shame as individually and collectively around our silences. And the thing is, I grew up in a repressive state. It wasn't quite totalitarian. And I grew up in a state where it was very clear what you could say publicly and what you couldn't. I found myself having fallen back on the same patterns. Right? And in a context where the penalties are severe but not life-threatening. And I think that shame spurred me. It spurs me. And I constantly find myself thinking, I attempted to have a similar conversation with a different group of colleagues, and there was just nothing, like no response, like just nothing, insensibility. Maybe it's the romantic in me, but I think I diagnose an insensibility to shame as meaning that the project of a collective world is in dire danger, is on life support. And if we can't, if we can't be moved by shame, are we then just prone to violence? I don't know. But thank you.
Thank you. Jack, we probably have time for one question online.
Sure.
And if there's more than one, maybe they could be held for the general Q&A after the panel.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll try and be fast.
I just have one here from Supriya. Supriya said, always such a pleasure listening to you, Brian. Thank you. I am picking on your first diagnosis, lack of shame. How is it possible? Shame can only be experienced when individuals think and feel that they have failed to meet certain standards, either their own or those imposed by others. Only then does that moral failure reflect something fundamentally wrong or unworthy about oneself. So I wonder, how do you imagine shame might genuinely arise in those who benefit from privilege and status quo, especially if they have not yet come to see themselves as implicated? Is it when there is some time lag, when everyone has agreed and you feel odd?
Damn it, Dr. Subramani, I thought we were friends. That is unsurprisingly brilliant, Supriya. You've made me think. Look, and I think if we go full circle, I don't think I hadn't consciously made that connection. You don't feel shame if you have a sense of yourself as sovereign and completely independent, right? I think the reason, I mean, and this is what the social contract theorists get right? Like the reason why the shared world is important, the reason why relatively powerless people need to congregate is that if they don't, you have a world in which, quote, Thucydides is very popular right now, the powerful do as they like, and the weak suffer what they must, right? The accumulation of collective power is the only way for the relatively weak to demand, to assert, to push back on the strength of the powerful. I think the only way you inculcate a sense of shame, Frantz Fanon has this beautiful thing where he says, we'll only address this alienation when we've put things right in a material sense. Yeah. Unless up until there's a situation in which things have been leveled out materially in some way. And the only way that I can see that's viable is, ordinary people recognizing that working towards a context in which there's respect for everybody's shared humanity is a much, much, much better way to go than banking on having a powerful patron. We're stuffed. And so I think maybe the answer lies, again, in that final point of humanizing the world and stepping into the public sphere en masse.
Okay, thank you so much to you, Supriya, for the amazing question, and thanks, Bryan, for your answer. So I'm now going to introduce you to Claire, as previously advised. So Associate Professor Claire Hooker. Claire's going to chair our panel discussion and will in turn introduce our panellists. Claire is Associate Professor of Health and Medical Humanities with Sydney Health Ethics. She's also President of the Arts and Health Network in New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. And I love this first line of Claire's bio. Claire's research supports people to flourish through good communication and understanding. So Claire is a polymath. There is no topic that she can't put her brain towards in a way that makes me, she's hiding under the table here. But Claire, she genuinely is a true scholar in intellect, and I'm so privileged to call her a friend and colleague. But Claire works across lots of different topics and can turn her hand to almost anything. Most specifically at the moment, she works in arts and health and the role that arts can play in the impact of climate and disaster management. And a thing that Claire did a few years ago was a play called Grace Under Pressure, which has been performed widely in hospitals to improve workplace culture in medicine. So I'm going to set those expectations super high for you, Claire. If you could just give me 5 minutes at the very end to wrap up, that would be awesome. Thank you.
That part's accurate, right? Yes, I'll look for you waving for your 5 minutes.
I've handed you over 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. Thank you for that, for the high expectations, but more especially for the real honour and pleasure of being here with this particular panel. I can't think of a greater privilege. Bryan, thank you for offering us an experience in the very spirit of Mars Little and joining for us discursively what has been present and repressed, a canonical literature that has shaped all of us with the many ways in which it has reverberated in literary forms throughout the world and thus brought us from shades of grey and into the technicolor that we didn't know we longed for until we got to see it a little bit, and it was beautiful to have it presented in that way. And it was in itself, as I understand it to be, a form, an articulation of the kind of thing that study, an invitation to study, might set up for us. Our distinguished panel to respond to that I'm going to read your bios because otherwise I might talk too much about you, and also because I assume they're the authorised versions. Shaya, Associate Professor Shaya Abimbola, who we're so lucky to have had with us for long enough to start to really deeply imbibe ways of thinking. Was born and raised in Nigeria and has taught, researched and written extensively on learning and governance in health systems and on knowledge practices and epistemic injustice in global health. He was awarded the Prince Claus Chair in Equity and Development at Utrecht University in 2020. And actually, Shaya, I don't know how to pronounce the name of the visiting scholars role that you can instruct me. At Northwestern, and actually there's just so many things that awards and honours that have accumulated that the one I particularly like, which is the WHO Thinker in Residence, isn't actually on this list, but I'm going to mention that one. So a scholar to match Bryan's beautiful performance. And Dr. Annie Sandrusi is a philosopher with expertise in gender and environmental justice, who's completed a PhD in phenomenology and aesthetics, so person after my own heart. And currently a research fellow at Macquarie University, working with the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence in Synthetic Biology, and is interested in how food and public health policy discourses make implicit commitments that interact with individuals' worldviews to influence ethical decision-making. And I love every aspect of that, and I'm really happy that we're bringing these things into conversation with Bryan. I'd like to start with something a little bit small, but it's part of my response to what we were offered. If we have talked until now about the three or perhaps one but interlocking diagnosis, perhaps for a moment I can invite our panel to talk about the prescriptions. And so Annie and then Shaya, I would love to know that what it is that you love when you are in the mode of study. Perhaps what it is, what kind of knowledge practices or practices you bring or would love to bring into this project of overcoming alienation and stepping back into engagement with these troubles that Bryan has invited us to look at directly.
Can I go first? I'm a bit distant from them because I've got viruses, so I'm trying to separate myself and not infect people. There's a lot in what Bryan said, and there's a lot that tempts me to respond specifically because there was several Nigerian things going on there. One of them, Yoruba Boy Running, which is a book I've been reading to my daughters. And the passage you quoted is from Ifa. It's an old poem that I listened to a lot growing up. And of course, the Asha song.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think that is the answer to your question, that I like to think with literature and with art. And both the humanizing tendencies that they have, but also the cautionary message that you often get about humanizing people that you get in literature. And when I saw your list of diagnoses, Bryan, something that came to mind for me is, again, this is one of the ways in which I think through writing essays. And I've been trying to write an essay titled "The Right to Be Curious." And it's an essay that I think, which I'm trying to challenge the taking for grantedness that social researchers have about the rights we have to study other people's lives. As if we have a right. I don't think we have a right. But anyway, so that's, you're trying to challenge that. And in doing that, I've been reading about Joseph Conrad, who in 1899 published a novel titled Heart of Darkness. He was a seaman, British Navy, Polish Brit, who was in Central Africa in the 1880s. I wrote a novel about the colonial meetings between Europe and Africa, and really depicted Africans as almost animalistic, whilst at the same time being really critical of imperialism. So you can have those two things at the same time. And I find that very interesting. Anyway, when I was a child, how long do I have?
Well, we need to give Annie a bit of time.
Okay, I'll be very fast. When I was a child, there was this book of essays in our house. It was a book of essays about Conrad. I don't know who owned it. It was either my father or my grandfather, but it was this book of essays. And in it, there was an essay by a guy named John Galsworthy, who was a British novelist, Nobel Prize winner in the 1930s.
I had that book in my house.
Excellent. There's a story there. Anyway, there's an essay, the essay that Galsworthy wrote was in extreme high praise of Conrad. And I've been thinking about the essay in relation with Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but also Chinua Achebe's charge in the 1975 lecture to Conrad about Conrad's racism. And there's something Conrad wrote in his biography, which I will read out now. It says, the ethical view of the universe involves us at last in so many cruel and absurd contradictions. We are the last vestiges of faith, hope, charity, and even reason itself seem ready to perish. That I have come to suspect that the aim of creation cannot be ethical at all. I would fondly believe that its object is purely spectacular. A spectacle for awe, love, adoration, or hate, if you like, but in this view, never for despair. Those visions, delicious or poignant, are a moral end in themselves. Now, this is a very interesting passage in accepting the world as it is, the unethical world as it is. And I was thinking about your three diagnoses, and I wanted to add this to your diagnosis. That there is also something of the acceptance of what Galsworthy, in writing about Conrad, would describe as the unethical morality of nature. And I feel that many of us have that problem, that I think we've accepted the world too much. That when you try to have a conversation about agitation, about doing things differently, there's that deep stream of acceptance that I feel it's linked perhaps to your list of diagnoses. But anyway, so yes, there and later on in his life, Conrad will say that he didn't know what he was doing in Congo. That why was he there? He had no business there. Anyway, so for me again, I think as you asked, through literature, through art, and through these kinds of reflections, that's where I make sense of the world and my place in it and what I should really think. And again, thank you, Brian, for that brilliant, wonderful, rich lecture.
Thank you, Shane. Annie, you write about aesthetics. And phenomenology. So it's experiential, it's in the body, and perhaps also engaged through these ways. Or would you also like to put in a good word for the habits of the scholar in their traditional ways?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Can everyone hear me? Okay. So thank you. And it's such an honor to have an opportunity to respond. So I was looking at the diagnoses and I was thinking that the diagnoses actually, to me, felt like you were crafting for us the picture of the situation that we are in as scholars, but particularly as scholars who are engaged in health, which is something that touches the lives of people. And I say that because I was trained as a philosopher, and so I could spend a lot of time in my own PhD doing work that might be relevant to the world, but I could do it in my own cocoon and choose who I want to read and therefore who I want to hear. And I mean, I wasn't totally free. There were the kind of norms of the institution and the people that I could anticipate would read my work. And it turns out that the reason I got that chose to pursue this kind of life of scholarship and the people who would eventually read my work were not matching. So the reason I say that is, as you were talking, Bryan, you talked a lot about our situation that we're in and how our position as scholars is in friction with the kind of really important issues facing our world, the crises that we're in. But at the same time, very basic issues like that I need to remain employed, and that I need to pursue the next thing, and that I'm sort of bound by the capitalist system that I work in. And so you talked a lot about capital accumulation. I wouldn't say you talked a lot about it, but it was the kind of in the background. And we know that. And I think that's the thing that we come across as the main challenge. I go, but how? Because I've got to go for the next grant. And maybe I do feel like I have something really important to say, but if I'm not here to say it, and I don't trust the community that I'm in to say it without me, what do I do? Okay. And that sounds a bit hubristic as well, because I'm not the only person in the community that can say it, but there is kind of a sense of like, what do? I have to survive. I have to stay so I can keep saying it. But then I thought that your diagnosis of humanizing the world, which sounds awfully poetic, was actually probably one of the most important kind of, I feel like the central one. But I do want to talk about the stop. You talked about the past reverberating into the present, and that we should, I guess you showed us as an example of the way you spoke, that we should take pause and feel the past reverberating. And so, because I'm a phenomenologist, Merleau-Ponty talks about inertia as the time of institutions. You're kind of plunged into this inertia. So you come in and you say, this is what I want to do. But you can't do the thing you really want to do, the thing that you love, until you're 10 years down the track, because you need to have the clout so that people will listen to you. You need to have learned the habits of the institution so that people will respect you. And then you need to apply for a bunch of grants that are carefully crafted so that at some point when you do the riskier grant, someone will trust that it's not as risky as it looks, that the problems and the people that you want to engage with, that you want to give leadership to, are not, they're not going to waste their money. And that's how it is. You know, when I got this postdoc and someone gave me mentoring, they said they want to see a return on investment, right? So it's a capital logic that's going on here. So we can't confront our shame for some really basic reasons, like our own, what I would call moral narcissism, and the philosopher in me is saying, you're using that term wrong. But what I mean is, we see this in people's engagement with crises. So for example, in the climate crisis, right? Climate change, like scientists have been telling us about climate change for forever. But there was a real turn in Australia, for instance, when we lived through those bushfires, Black Summer of, I think it was 2019 or 2020. And people felt the change materially, phenomenally in air quality. And they went, oh no, this is a real problem that could affect me. But we also see it in the current genocide. If we look at the groups that are advocating the most, like I'm just thinking, for example, one of the earliest lobby groups that came out and was kind of helped by social media was the kind of Mothers Collective Against the Palestinian Genocide. Why? Because the images of children were so potent and so powerful and could reach people who felt like they had children. Does that mean, I don't want to diminish the activism or the kind of incitement to action, but I want to say that it's really hard to get past the problems that we don't feel. And so it's really hard to grapple with the fact that we as scholars participate in an yes, we're not the wealthiest in society, not by a mile, and any comfort we have is tenuous for most of our careers. But at the same time, I go home and in a cost of living crisis, I can eat and I can feed my kids. And so my question is always going to be like, what is health for? And that's where I would think the humanizing the world is really important, because your quotation from Lisa Belliard, just those lines. I shift the couch, you pour the wine. I can be happy, you can laugh. And so when I take my kids to the doctor or to the hospital, or when I think about whatever health crisis they are facing or may be facing, or whatever health crisis I may face in the future, I think, is it so that they can be happy? Is it so that they can be laughed? And what are all the ways that that can look like? And it's really easy to lose sight of that, because being a scholar means you have to speak with clarity and with precision, and you are trained to do that so well. And I'm trained by some exceptional people. And at the same time, it is hard to speak with clarity and with precision and not have to tidy out all of the things that are excessive to that, all of the things that are messy. And some of the basic things are that we live in a society where maybe health is trying to be optimized, but some people don't have their basic needs met. The other thing I want to say about the past, and this is probably the last thing I'll say, and because I'm thinking about capitalism and who gets to eat and who has to starve, there is another way that we can look away from our shame. You talked about genocide. The past reverberates into the present, but we can starve the past. And we can do that through material means. We can create the material conditions that stop people from participating as members of our political community. Thank you.
So, let's get 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you both. That was brilliant. I'll just go in reverse order. So, yeah. Look. So, Annie, so I hear you. The British Medical Journal has a journal titled Global Health. It's titled Global Health. The chair edited. Is it titled Global Health?
BMJ
Right?
Global Health.
Yes, BMJ Global Health. That could have gone a couple of different ways. Global health is a fraud space. Aspects of it are brilliant, and aspects of it suspect too harsh. I don't know. And the fact that Cher was the editor, the fact that you were there and you molded and curated it for 10 years, and I imagine we've never had this conversation. I imagine there was a lot of negotiations, a lot of difficulties, and probably at some point compromises that had to be made to sustain it. Every time I'm in a healthy institution, I know that there's somebody I should thank for doing the really difficult and sometimes messy work of holding that space and making that institution pleasant and livable, right? And so for the people who lead institutions, I was recently I found myself encouraging a dear friend to compromise with the powers that be, because if they didn't, the institution that they ran would have been endangered. And I thought that would be a much greater harm than the ickiness that they would have to endure. Yeah, it was an unkind thing to ask my friend, but that was the logic behind it. And so you're right. I think sometimes, like, we shouldn't be naive, right? At the same time, I think we make the mistake. There's a kind of unhealthy narcissism where we think, if I'm no longer here, then what? It's like everything will be fine if you're no longer there. And sometimes it's okay if it gets to a point where the institution has had it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Easy to say, I know, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think when we're doing the calculation, what we forget is, as MS Izere made clear, as Albert Memmi made clear, the act of perpetuating harm and of complicity in harm makes those on the harm side of the equation monstrous, right? My deep concern my horror at what's happening to Palestinians isn't because I identify with Palestinians. It's because I fear the monstrosity, the malignant monstrosity that is overtaking me the longer I am caught up on the harm side of the equation. And it might not be obvious in the immediate, but ask Wendy, malignancies are like that. They're not obvious in them, and that's what makes them so dangerous. And as scholars, as intelligent people, George Lamming has this wonderful phrase, the education of sentiment. Part of our task, I think, part of that humanizing the world, being in the public sphere, is conscientizing and educating people, helping people who don't yet feel that they are cancerous recognize what's going on. And I think the biggest charge I have against us as a collective is we have abdicated our responsibility to the public, in part because that's the path of least resistance of the powers that be. And I think we're poorer for it. So, and I think we need to kind of grapple with that, right? I think we really need to grapple with that. And share, like, Conrad. Conrad. Fun fact, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he ended up spending a lot of time thinking about Caribbean literature. But when he was in Leeds in London, they had to decide who he was going to focus on in his dissertation. His first love was Conrad. And I always, I'm slowly working on a book on Ngugi. It always makes me wonder, like, what his body of work would have looked like if he had stayed on that Conrad trajectory. He's an interesting liminal figure, right? Like, he's somebody who, by virtue of being white, was able to transform himself from a Pole into a part of the British Empire and to be accommodated in it. And I mean, he's just human all too human, right? Like, he pointed out a lot of the horror of British imperialism in Africa and in Asia. But part and parcel of becoming British was adopting the prejudices and also coming to terms with taking for a person who had to flee Poland as a result of imperialism ends up in a place and adopts an imperial attitude. Again, reverberations. Yeah, there's just a lot to think there.
Can I, in fact, ask us to think about shame in that context? Because that was a chord that was a note that struck a chord in the questions that came at the beginning. We've talked a lot about capitalism, and I have with me here people who are scholars of systems. Capitalism is a system, and I guess I learned system thinking originally by learning Marx. That was my first place of learning about systems. I didn't learn it from Adam Smith. One thing that Marx taught me is all of the ways in which systems emergently produce things that are not the products of linear causation. And they are also not altered by the actions of any of their individual inputs. They therefore, among other things, create asymmetries. One of those asymmetries might be about shame and about what it takes to have and to encounter it. I have noticed in my own research around risk perception and communication, the completely other side of my working life. So how is it that people come to find some things fearful or some things resistant as part of how we can talk to each other or not in a polity, is that shame creates a sense of shame, creates one of the most profoundest pieces of resistance to being able to revise one's own positions on things profoundly. And the stronger the injustice, the worse that effect, such that the perpetrators are increasingly less able to undertake the processes of self-reflection that one might want to, and I hear it in what the populist right says. We don't want to feel ashamed of our ancestors. We don't want to feel sorry for the past. We want to take pride in who it is that we come from. So that when people ask of them that they accept those injustices, the resistance gets stronger and stronger. And the burden of making it safe to see those things falls on the oppressed. Shay, I'd love to know what you think they're all about.
That's a lot. I want to connect what you've said to what Annie said and Brian's response. And Annie, if I heard you correctly, one of the things you were describing there are the compromises one has to make early in one's career. And I have this story that I tell. It's a conceptual story, and I'll tell you now. Where if you were to become an academic with fire in your belly, wanting to do things differently, make the world right, etc. And if you were to make compromises, which many of us end up making, if you were to make compromises, you have two sets of choices. One of them is to recognize that there are compromises and to feel perpetually uncomfortable about it. And the other choice is to kill your conscience and decide that those compromises are in fact the right thing to do, to lie to yourself and believe that lie. Now, if you were to lie to yourself and believe the lie, and you are successful in your career, when a young person comes with fire in their belly wanting to change everything, there is shame. There's shame. Because you look at that person and you say, that was me. That was me. And you will fight that person. You really fight. Can you stop being this person? Because you are triggering shame. Yeah. So I'm often thinking about that type of shame as well. And Brian graciously mentioned my time as editor of the journal. And I was going to say that I was very fortunate that I didn't have to make too many compromises. And one of the triggers for my decision to step down was a compromise that was too much, which was that I understood my role. And I've been writing about this now. I'm writing about my experience. And as I went back to read the emails before I was appointed, this was early 2015. And part of the description of my role was that opinionated discussions about controversial topics are welcome. BMJ wrote this by themselves. And then sometime in early 2024, because we had published articles about the genocide in Gaza, they decided that any potentially controversial article will have to be screened. Screened by the BMJ. And I thought, well, everything that I think makes this role worthwhile for me requires that I make decisions about potentially controversial things. And if I can't make those decisions anymore, then there's no point. There's no point. So again, often there's a breaking point with compromises. And again, I remind myself that if I were to have sort of rolled over on that, again, I would be ashamed of myself. Or I would have to lie to myself that was okay.
Thank you. I think there is something else that happens when the young person comes, though. I think that when you spend the time, work on systems. And so you know so much more about the place of ethics in a kind of much more complicated economic system, which I think is something amazing, because sometimes you can be a scholar in philosophy or in social philosophy and politics and never really get a sense of how economics works. Sometimes the more experienced person thinks that the young person with the fire in their belly is naive about what they're up against. And there are, I guess, you can put out the light by compromising, but other people can put out your light by making the day-to-day of the work that you do and the care that you have for the work that you do reminding you of how hard it is. So, I mean, so if we think of ourselves as a community, we take that in the genuine sense. The way to keep the fire going is to find a community that may not be in the place that you are. But that's not easy to do. It's not easy to do because sometimes the community that you're working with is so habituated in its ways of doing that you will always be an outsider. And you will go home to the place that feels like a paradise and a refuge away from, you know, the horrors of academia in Australia. And sometimes, though, the people, I guess the other thing I would say is, you know, I started off really strongly identifying myself as a feminist philosopher. It's very hard to do what you call feminist philosophy without betraying a lot of groups of people, including other women. And sometimes you commit that betrayal before you recognize it because you think you're doing a really good thing. So the area that I work in, and that I will continue to work in, but that maybe people will listen to me less in, is an area called sexual difference feminism, where it is really hard to talk about something like the maternal, which is a central question in my work, and speak to the people who are speaking about it. So finding the people that you speak with, we have to acknowledge it is really hard, and the people who will hear you is really hard. So in a sense, the fire can be extinguished by other people as well. And keeping that fire is really challenging, but there are ways to do it. It just, some people are overburdened with it.
To follow on from that, I face difficult choices because time is limited and the subject is great. And what we actually need, of course, is a lot of what we never have, which is time with each other. Can I sacrifice your response, Bryan, to enable people from the audience here or online to also get their opportunity to join the conversation? Do others have comments or their questions online?
There's a question online, yeah. They said they're happy to unmute and ask it.
Great.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriela. I wish I was with you today, but I decided to be mature and stay at home and not spread my germs. But thank you for making this hybrid. It's a pleasure to be able to watch and participate in the conversation. And thank you, Bryan, for your brilliant lecture, as usual. I'm not surprised at all. I think I just wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the element that maybe struck a chord, as someone said, which is the lack of shame diagnosis. And I wanted to challenge you on that diagnosis, actually, and perhaps ask to add other elements into the mix. As a sociologist of emotion, I'm very interested in shame, and I would like to invoke a definition of shame that I quite like, which is by a feminist scholar who worked for the institution where you are now, which is the University of Sydney, Elsbeth Probyn. In the book Blush, Faces of Shame, Probyn offers a really interesting definition of shame as an informative emotion that tell us what our investment in the world is. And basically, Probyn is saying that we blush when there is an inconsistency between the self and the gaze of others. So an inconsistency between how we want to be perceived and how we actually are. And other people witness that moment, and that's when we become blushed. And I think it's very interesting because then Probyn is arguing that shame is informative because it shows what we care about, our investment in the world. And in the tale of the little boy that you started your lecture on, I think it's quite easy to perceive the shame because, it's the classic, body disposal shame. And, it's about his investment in the community, his fear of, not being seen as a dignified member of the community anymore, and this willingness for belonging. and wanting to belong and to be seen as a dignified member of it. But when we look at us as like a community of scholars who, sign petitions for Randa and are horrified by what is happening, at the same time that we fear to speak out loud and be censored or lose our jobs, etc., I feel that there is a lot of shame in there because we are aware of that inconsistency. So yeah, I wonder if there's something else luring behind that diagnosis of shame, which is perhaps paralysis by fear, or something else, or other emotions there are in there. Because I think a lot of academics are brutally aware, or perhaps brutally not so much, but are aware of that we don't walk or talk necessarily. And I think there is a lot of shame about talking about this, but the shame is there, like we feel the shame. So I wonder if there's something else that we could talk about, other feelings that may be connected to that shame, or if maybe it's a point that I'm missing. But because so many people brought the shame and the lack of shame, I wonder if we do lack shame, or we have been paralyzed by shame. So sorry, this is a very long question, but that's it for me. Thank you.
We all have to think and talk and write our way to what we think, right? Bryan.
All right. Very quickly. Sorry, very quickly. Thank you, Gabby. That was characteristically brilliant. I disagree with you. It's gonna land me into trouble. I think those who experience turmoil, for the most part, right? For the most part, I mean, like Aaron says, like when you retreat, for whatever reason you retreat from society, just don't lie to yourself about it. Be honest. I think it is profound, share that you resigned. I think, like, mad respect. If the story ended with, I made this compromise that I am ashamed of, but I did it in order to try and keep pushing back against some of the sensorial excesses. I mean, like, politically, I'm more in favor of the decision that you took, but if you're taking a different decision and were walking and living with that shame and all of the difficult emotions that came by, and even if part of it had to do with fear or whatever, I'd still be like, I get it. I think my concern is when our investments are so much that we allow ourselves to become more and more dulled to all of these feelings, Gabby. The person who's like just really struggling and it's a struggle, I think that turmoil eventually moves on one way or the other and is actually like really healthy, right? My concern is Australian society. The social contract here says invest in material well-being, like it, and then shut up. And as long as you keep quiet and as long as you make the right investments, you can have a comfortable retirement and a comfortable quality of life. And my concern is one can get to the point where they're so habituated to that decision that they eventually find ease in it and no longer experience shame.
Perhaps your diagnosis is too much comfort. Is there anyone? Yes, Kate.
Should I take a microphone for?
Oh, it's a virus microphone.
I will not give you a virus.
Do you want to get that?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Shea and Annie. This has been really, really interesting. And I have to say, I think I agree with everything you said. But I want to ask you now, and if there's time, I would love to hear what Annie and Shea think too about greed. And I think especially in the last comment that you just made, Bryan, and I'm thinking about greed in terms of you mentioned Aristotle first. Pleonexia, the idea of wanting more, taking more than is rightly due, also avoiding the burdens that are rightly yours. So I wonder what you think in terms of that as an also a potential further diagnosis, and I don't know what you would say about it and what all three of you would say about it.
And you have like 1 minute each, and you can't be Stephen Fry, who I'm hearing in my head discoursing on the 7 deadly sins.
I'll try and make it 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. You're absolutely brilliant. Damn it. I think I'm just nicer than you, because I already felt bad about coming and potentially being offensive, right? Like being like, you're greedy too. Or maybe it's self-preservation. I don't want to look at my own greed. Look, I'm gonna have to think about that. That sounds right. I think that's terrifying. I think that's really, really, really terrifying. But that resonates. Thank you.
Your 1 minute, Annie.
Okay.
That it reminds me of your comment.
Not on yet.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Your comment reminded me of what Claire mentioned earlier about the capitalist logic or capitalism as a system, which itself relies very much on greed or on wanting more and more, never feeling like you have enough, because you're programmed to always want more. And when you're programmed that way, you can't allow shame to stop you. If anything at all, you rationalize your greed away from the shame that might have stopped you.
Yeah, I think in the scholarly life, it always feels like, and in the broader kind of system, it always feels like people have more than you. And I think the system pits us against each other in very, very careful ways, so that we are in competition with people that we are also in community with, and with people who we care about, and with people who are working towards the same goals as us. And at the same time, we're set up to have a very individualistic lifestyle, and it feels like everybody's doing better than me. And so, yeah, and I agree with what you said.
I've recently learned the term prefigurative politics, and that is a way of just conjuring for a moment the world that we would like to be in. Thank you for helping us conjure for a moment a way of being together that is not alienated and that incites us to study. Ainsley, I've delivered this on time.
Thanks so much, Claire, and to Shaya and Annie. Some really, it just keeps getting better. Thank you. I appreciate there were 1 or 2 questions in the audience that we didn't have time to get to, so please join us afterwards. I'm sure our panelists would be happy to speak one-on-one as well. What I'd like now to do is to say another thank you for coming. If you're not a member of our network, Sydney Health Ethics, and I think that actually includes some academics at Sydney Health Ethics based on conversations I had earlier today, you do need to actually physically join. It doesn't happen magically in the background. So please scan that QR code to the left and add your details, and it will magically go into a database that Jack looks after, and communications will come to you going forth. The other thing we'd love to hear is what you felt about today's event, which is an annual lecture. So please take a moment to complete the survey. If you are attending online, I believe there might be a link heading into the Zoom. Thank you, Jack. Or you could also scan the QR code on your screen. What I would also like to do is to say my own thank you. I know, Brian, you very comprehensively thanked everybody at the start, which was so lovely. Thank you. But I would also like to give my thanks to the Jack Temple and the FMH Networks team, including Susie, who welcomed you when you got here today, and Kathy Barnett, who oversees the network, and also all of the support we've had in the room today, which has helped make the event run as it has. I'd also like to give a very big thank you to Camilla Scanlon for lots of work behind the scenes, including getting here an hour early today to set up the tables and think about all sorts of things in the way that is a very special talent that you have. So thank you, Camilla. And in her absence or in her online presence, I would also like to thank Supriya Subramani, who is the deputy convener of our network and who did lots of legwork, even though she's currently on sabbatical, to organise our panellists for today. So thank you, Supriya. If you have attended in person, I should also thank Claire. I think I sort of said hello and thank you, but
I was thanked by being able to be
here. And then it's just going to get silly because I'm just going to keep going. So if you are here in person, I would like to invite you to join us in the foyer now, where we have some drinks and canapes for your enjoyment. And if you are online, say thank you very much for your attendance, and we will see you at the next one. Enjoy the rest of your day.